Graduate School of Education. The recording is in progress, so I will repeat that so to make sure that it is in the recording. Meredith Rowe is the Sol Zens Professor of Early Learning and Development at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. Professor Rowe leads a research program on understanding the role of parent and family factors in children's early language and literacy development. And she's particularly interested in uncovering how variations in children's early communicative environments contribute to language development, and in applying this knowledge to the development of intervention strategies for low-income families. So, Meredith, I would like to give you the floor and share with us the presentation that you have prepared for us. Okay, if there are any questions during Professor Rowe's presentation, you can post them in the chat, and I will try to select those that are most relevant to all of us. And Professor Rowe has accepted to answer these questions while she's doing the presentation. And of course, after the presentation, there will be time for question and answer also. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Kees. Can you hear me? Very well, okay. Yes. Great. Hopefully this will work out. I'm going to share my screen here. Let me just get this started. Okay, do we see my slides? Okay. Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you, Kees, for the introduction. Thank you, Catherine and Paola and all of you for inviting me to this group. I'm looking forward to sharing some of our work with you today. And as Kees said, please feel free to, I've prepared about 45 or 50 minutes, but I am happy to stop along the way, especially if there are clarification questions, if things aren't clear. So feel free to put any questions in the chat and we will take care of it. So let's just minimize this. Okay. Sorry. All right. I'm going to talk today about the sort of features or qualities of children's early language environments that promote language development. And I'll start by just thinking or, making sure we're all on the same page about why early language development is so important. I know this is a topic we all care about very much, but there are many reasons why early language development is so important. One of the sort of key outcomes that we tend to focus on in the research is, sorry, here we go. Would you guys, do you mind putting yourselves on mute if you're during the presentation? That'd be great. Okay, thank you. So often we think of third grade reading comprehension as an important language and literacy outcome. It's a metric that tends to predict all kinds of school success and graduation and later in life outcomes. And it's also a point where we see a lot of variability in children. So for example, in the US context, if you look at this chart here, this is data from national sample in the United States. And we see that from the beginning of kindergarten to the beginning of third grade, there's this pretty consistent achievement gap in reading based on income level. And so again, this is from the United States, but basically each line in this graph represents a quintile of socioeconomic status. So the highest line is the children from families with the highest level of income, and the lowest line is the lowest level. And what you can notice there is that the lines stay pretty much parallel over that time period. Up in third grade reading comprehension, what we can see here is that it's quite evident at the beginning of kindergarten already. And so, children are coming to school already with this wide variation and gaps in their reading achievement. So one of the big questions then is, well, what is reading in kindergarten? When children arrive in kindergarten, most children aren't reading books yet at this point with the 5-year-olds. And so what we know is that in
kindergarten, one of the strongest predictors of later reading comprehension is children's oral language skills, in particular their vocabulary. Of course, it's important for children to learn how to decode text, and children's ability to decode text and phonics is by second grade becomes a very, very strong predictor of reading comprehension. But when children get to school, their vocabulary skills vary extremely widely and are a very, very strong predictor of their later reading comprehension outcomes, as well as other outcomes. So another thing that we know is that children's vocabularies are growing from birth, basically, and that there is a huge effect of their early language exposure on their vocabulary development. So basically, this income achievement gap in reading in third grade can be traced all the way back to the language exposure that children experience during the early childhood period. So that sort of sets the stage. Like, early oral language experience can serve as the foundation for later literacy skills. Okay. We also know that this is work by Kim Noble, that language development is the area of early development that is most influenced by environmental factors. So they did some work looking at different domains of development, memory, language development, executive functions, etc. And language development is the area that is most influenced by environmental factors, which is also one example of the environment affecting.
Meredith, may I interrupt you for a moment? Meredith?
I don't know if any.
Meredith, may I interrupt you for a moment? Can you hear me? We seem to be losing.
Came out about a month ago in the UK. There was a big study. Oh, am I frozen?
Meredith, we seem to be losing your audio.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Right now it's clear, but the past couple of minutes were very unclear.
Okay, I'm sorry. So now you can hear me? All right, I just went back on my internet instead of my phone. Let me go back in and see if this works. I'm really sorry about this.
Okay, so maybe you could go back one slide if you please.
This one or back one more?
Yes, fine. This one is fine.
All right, we got this one. All right, we got this, the whole sort of language as a foundation. Okay, here I was just saying there, it's not, I mean, just to make the point that it's really not so surprising that that language is influenced by experience, right? Young children can't read yet. I mean, the ways they pick up words is by hearing those words in their environment. And it turns out this study by Kim Noble found that of all the domains of early development, memory, executive functions, language is the sort of domain that's most influenced by environmental factors, which is great to know because it means that we might be able to manipulate the environment to improve language development for young children. And here is just an example I was going to highlight. I don't know if any of you saw this study, came out a month ago in the UK. When they lifted their lockdown after the pandemic, they did this large study in London area, basically showing that a lot of young children were going back to preschool, and everyone was reporting that their language skills were lagging compared to where they should have been due to being in lockdown and potentially having, you know, perhaps less environmental stimulation from other interlocutors. So historically, we know from the literature that language input, and by language input, I just mean the language that children hear in their environment. And historically, it was studied or at least represented mostly as the amount. How much language do children hear? And the more that they hear, the faster their vocabulary growth, right? And so this is work from Hart and Risley, and they also showed that the amount of language that children hear tends to differ by socioeconomic status. And then we had a large number of other studies basically showing the same thing, that on average, children from different socioeconomic groups hear different amounts of language, which relates to their language development. So now where the field has been turning for the last 10 years or so is an understanding that it isn't so much the amount of language that children hear that matters so the most, but instead the qualities or features of that language. So this pie chart is just to, you could imagine that this pie chart represents the amount of variation in all those kindergartners' vocabularies when they get to school. And what we know now is that if you take into consideration the amount of talk that they hear during early childhood, but also the qualities of that talk, this orange chunk represents the variation that would be explained by measures of quality. And this green slice is the little piece that might get left over being explained by quantity. And then this gray side are these other factors that also play a role, whether they be genetics or whatever, the things we're not typically measuring. But I do still think it's important to show this, that about half of the variability in general across a bunch of studies can be explained by environmental factors, by exposure to language in the environment, which is quite a bit. Okay, so before I go on and tell you about what we know about the qualities or features of language that that seem to make a big difference, I thought we might use the chat and have you sort of, Catherine would call this a chat jot, have you maybe think about what features or qualities of the communication of caregivers that you think would matter, right? So if it isn't the amount of talk that matters the most, of course, children need to be exposed to some certain minimum level of speech, right? But beyond that, if it's not the amount that matters, what is it? So let's just have a little chat conversation, or not conversation, but if you could put in the chat some of the things that you think might play a role. And then I'll tell you what the literature says. So contingency, exactly. Reframing, extending, open-ended questions, eye contact, multiple rounds, holding meaningful conversations, multi-languages, vocabulary variation, sentence structures. Sorry, Pamela. Facial expressions. Okay, great. Expansions. Sensitivity. Okay, perfect. So you see what's coming out in the chat is a variety of different types of things that people are focusing on, right? So you have stuff like paying attention to what the child's interested in, eye contact, right? These sort of interactional turn taking, right? But then you also have things like sentence structure, right? And this is exactly the issue in the field, is that the qualities or the features of input can be measured in so many different ways, right? What are we talking about? Are we talking about things like turn taking, or are we talking about asking WH questions? You know, these are very different types of variables when it comes to analysis. And so the way that we made sense of this in this recent paper that was published with Catherine was to think about the language environment along 3 dimensions, right? So we have the interactional dimension, which sort of encompasses that turn-taking type of piece. We have the linguistic dimension, which is the linguistic form of what's being said or what children are hearing. And then we have a conceptual dimension, which really is focused more on the content of what the language is representing and how attuned that might be to the cognitive development of the child. And so what I'm going to do is walk you through these 2 dimensions and tell you about the literature in each area and with some examples. Okay, so another piece that we also have to keep in mind is that from birth to age 5, children have very growing language skills themselves, right? So you would not talk to this little baby the same way you would talk to this preschooler, right? That just wouldn't make sense. The language environment needs to be somewhat tailored to the age of the child for maximum benefits. So in addition to the 3 dimensions that I'll go through, I'm also going to talk about how these features or qualities of input change over the period from birth to around age 5. Okay, so the first feature, the interactional feature, the first dimension, is that the communication needs to be interactionally supportive, okay? And now this actually remains constant over the entire period and beyond. There's been a lot of research, like a lot of this came up in the chat, looking at contingency, right? Responsiveness. You want the interaction to be fluent and connected, okay? And so that is pretty much has been found at a variety of different ages, from infancy up to preschool. We know all the previous research on joint attention. Children seem to learn more and learn better when they are engaged in interactions that are contingent and responsive and fluent and connected. All right, so I'm going to give you a few examples of this. So here, I've just been thinking about some of these screen examples because of the whole COVID situation lately. But from the very beginning, Pat Kuhl has shown, for example, that young babies cannot learn sounds in a foreign language if they're exposed to them on a television screen, whereas if they're exposed to them in person, they do learn. So for example, in this study, she had 9-month-old babies on the left-hand side. These are American babies who are learning English, and they came to the lab for repeated visits with a Mandarin-speaking woman who read this book with them and, exposed them to Mandarin. And then on the right-hand side, the same age babies from the same population were exposed to the same woman saying the same thing, but the woman was on a screen, right? And not there with them. And so what was interesting about this is that she found that the babies in the live situation learned to discriminate the phonemes in Mandarin, but the babies in the screen situation did not, right? So for young babies, there's something about the social interaction and contingency that matters for picking up a language. Similarly, for toddlers, Roseberry and colleagues did a study looking at Skype. This was before we were all living on Zoom. But basically what they found was that with, I think it was 20 to 20, or maybe 20 to 30-month-olds, they were trying to teach these toddlers verbs, novel verbs. And some of them had a live person teaching them the verbs, and some of them had a video chat, like a Zoom or a Skype kind of situation with one person teaching them the verbs. And then some of them learned the verbs just by watching the screen, right? With no person, no contingency, the same talk, but no contingency. And they basically sort of found findings that mirror Pat Kuhl's findings, where if you're in the video chat or the live interaction, you learn the verbs. But if you're just watching someone teach you those verbs on the screen, you're not learning them. And so this social contingency is extremely important in infancy and toddlerhood. We do know, though, that once children are a little bit older, say after 30 months, they can pick up vocabulary words from television shows, right? They can learn from overhearing. But in the earlier ages, this social contingency is extremely important. And then getting up a little bit older, we did some work. This is work by a former student, Rachel Romeo, where she had a sample of lower income families in the Boston area, 4 to 7-year-olds. She had them wear the Lena device, which is basically an audio device that children can wear for a weekend. And it counts up how much words they hear and how many conversations they engage in and how many words they produce. And so what she found, and we also brought these same children into a lab at MIT and did an fMRI study, listening comprehension, and a whole battery of oral language assessments. And so what Rachel found was the number of conversational turns per hour in the home predicted the children's scores on the language composite. And what was interesting is that the number of words they heard did not predict, and the number of words they produced did not predict, which was surprising. It was just the amount of conversations they engaged in that was predictive of the language score. And she also found that that relationship was mediated by the children's language processing on an fMRI task. So the assumption here that needs to be tested further is that children that have opportunities to engage in more back and forth conversations are building their processing skills, say, quicker than children that don't have those opportunities, and that's what's driving the increase in their language comprehension and production on the composite. Okay, so that's just some examples of the interactionally supportive across development of that dimension. And I will go on to the next dimension. So here we're looking at linguistically adaptive. So this is the form of the language that's being spoken. What are the children hearing in terms of how diverse is the vocabulary, how complex is the syntax, these types of things. And what we know here is that it's quite variable across development, what helps young children. So for 6-month-olds, for example, we know that speaking in what's called infant-directed speech, or that baby talk sort of type of motherese, you know, we all know what that sounds like, right? Like, oh, you're such a cute baby, right? So that elongation of the vowels and the high pitch is actually helpful for infants. It keeps them attentive. They prefer it to regular speech. And also in these young ages, it's really helpful. It's found to be helpful to repeat words. So children need to hear, when they're really young, words used multiple times before they can learn them. So repetition, motherese is helpful. Whereas, you know, jump up to 30 months and, you know, Catherine's work with Tahava Wiseman has shown, and others, that here what you actually don't want is repetition. What you really want is diversity and sophistication, right? So these, the qualities of the linguistic nature of the speech varies as children get older. And I'm just going to give you a couple more examples here. So here's one study that we did where we had a pretty large sample of low-income fathers and their toddlers, and they played for 10 minutes. This is data that came out of the Early Head Start study. And we, you know, transcribed all those interactions and counted up everything the fathers were doing. And it turned out that it was not the amount that the fathers were talking that predicted the children's vocabulary, but the proportion of their talk that was actually WH questions. And so these are who, what, where, when, why, how questions in English. So fathers that were asking more of those questions, and many of them were what questions during book reading. It was this sort of sequence of like, what's that? And the child would say cow, and what's that? But this was the type of feature of those interactions in general that predicted the children's 24-month vocabulary and also their 36-month verbal reasoning. Whereas if we just looked at how many utterances the fathers produced, there was no effect there. So that's one example with 2-year-olds. Here's an example from Preschool Classrooms, work by Janelle and Huttenlocker. She looked at children in preschools all over the Chicago area over the course of 1 year. And they tested the children's syntactic development at the beginning of the year with a comprehension task that they created, and tested the children at the end of the year also. And then in the middle of the year, they got a sample of each teacher's speech from their sort of morning circle time meeting. And what they found was that the teachers who used more complex sentences during that circle time had children who grew more over the course of the year in their syntactic comprehension. And so this study is actually really important because a lot of times when we do this work on input, people just say, oh, it's not really the input, it's just genetics, you know. But here you see that, you know, these teachers are not related to these children. It's just another environment the children are in for a long period of time, and yet the children that were, I mean, the teachers that were producing more, relative clauses, complex sentences had students in their classes who gained more knowledge over the course of the year. So much of what I'm talking about is relevant to parents, also to caregivers in early childhood settings. Okay, so that's a little summary of the linguistically adaptive dimension. And now I'll go on to the conceptually challenging dimension. So here the idea is, I think one of the things that came up in the chat really quickly was maybe communication that's focused on the child's interest. And that sort of is what we're getting at here, right? Like with 1-year-olds, we know from a whole bunch of research that children learn best if you talk about what is right in front of them and what they're looking at, right? If you point at the dog and say, yeah, that's a doggy, that's a really great learning opportunity for the child. The child's interested in the dog, it's right there in front of them. However, when you get to preschoolers, age 30 months and up, what we see is sort of, obviously children could very easily at that age pick up a word if you point at the, something they've never seen before and label it. But what seems to be more helpful is having what's called these decontextualized conversations that are more abstract and beyond the here and now, rather than focused on the here and now. So
there is a question in the chat.
Okay, what is it?
Could you please answer that? It's about, what about the quality of questions during dialogic reading?
Yeah, so that's exactly right. I think it depends on the age of the child, but like the reading we were looking at with those toddlers, we looked at the WH questions and they were helpful. That it was mostly the what questions that were happening, because those are the questions those children could handle. I think with dialogic reading, often questions are encouraged and helpful. It's just that they should get slightly more complex as the children get older. So you might want to see more of those inferencing questions, like, why do you think the character did this? Or what do you think is going to happen next? Right. So that sort of gets you a little further up in the developmental range. So I always like one way to think about the questions is, in our culture, questions tend to be prevalent. They tend to be helpful. And I think there's a sort of dimension of them, right? The where are the easier ones. You can ask the where questions with the 1-year-olds and they can just point to answer. They don't even have to be talking, right? Where's the elephant? Right there, right? And then, with that 2-year-olds, a lot of the what questions we tend to see. And then when children get older, the whys and the hows kick in and can be useful at promoting talk beyond the book. Does that help? Yeah.
Yes, great. Thank you.
Okay. Yep, sure. So here we are in the conceptually challenging dimension. And what I'm going to do now for the example of this is tell you about a intervention study that we did, a little pilot intervention study focusing on this decontextualized talk. So as I said, decontextualized talk is, this grew out of work by Catherine, language that is sort of removed from the here and now. It's more abstract, right? So when we look at how this type of talk is used in home or school environments, typically in preschools or homes, what you see are causal explanations about how things work in the world, right? Explaining germs, things like that are, abstract. Narrative utterances about the past or the future. So talking with your child about what you did yesterday, what you might do tomorrow. And also pretense tends to be an early version of this type of talk. You might be pretending something is something else that's not actually there. There are different contexts when this type of talk seems to appear more than others. Obviously, pretense does occur during play, but narrative utterances and explanations tend to show up in other types of contexts, like meal times here in this photo. You're not spending the entire mealtime talking about the food. You might be also discussing, how your day was and things like that, or driving in the car or bath time. There are other times of day where you see these types of conversations more. So I'm going to show you just an example of what we mean. This is a mealtime conversation in a family. This is a middle-class family from the Boston area. And these two excerpts, the contextualized talk and the decontextualized, are from the same mealtime, same people. And this is just how we decide, sort of what is contextualized, what's decontextualized. And so you can see here on the left, in a little example of contextualized talk, the child says, I want more rice than Lizzie. The mother, you want more rice than Lizzie? The child says, is this white rice? She says, yeah, it's like cheesy rice. And the child says, is it white? Mother says, yeah, it's white. Child says, yay, white rice. The mother says, you have white rice. The child says, white rice. And then she says, it's actually called couscous. So this is all very much about what's going on the table, right in front of them, here and now, contextualized conversation. The child probably learned the word couscous, right? It's not like this is a bad conversation to agree in, but you just see it's a here and now contextualized conversation. And then on the right-hand side, you see an example that happened a little later in the meal, where the mother starts saying, so tomorrow, daddy says, if you sleep and don't wake up in the morning, he'll take you out to breakfast. The child says, oh. And she said, the only tricky part is mommy has to go for a really long run. The child says, why do you have to? And the mother said, because I'm going to do that race with so-and-so in a few weeks. And the child said, And she said, I'm going to run really far. The child says, where are you having it? And the mother said, where's the race? And the child said, yeah. She said, it's in New Hampshire. The mother says, it's a race that mommy does. And then the child says, am I going to be there cheering you? Am I coming to cheer you on? And the mother says, yep, you're going to come cheer. Okay. So it's just an example of how, like, the mother started out talking about tomorrow. Then she ended up talking about something in the further distant in the future. The child went along right with it, knew exactly what she was saying, to the point where she started asking questions about, am I going to be there? And, completely understood and was able to engage in this conversation. This is a 4-year-old. Okay, so what we're trying to do in this study is help parents understand that they already engage in this decontextualized stuff with their conversations with their children. It happens all the time, but that it's really helpful, right? Because parents might not realize that. Talking about the past, talking about the future, providing explanations. These are helpful ways to communicate with children, because that's what we found in the literature. So just to summarize what we've found, we know that parents' use of this type of talk significantly predicts children's vocabulary growth from age 3 to 5. And that's true in many studies, and it's true controlling for the amount of parent talk, right? So we're controlling for the contextualized talk. It's not just that parents that do more of this talk more. It's actually that this type of talk seems to be driving effects. We also find that decontextualized talk is more syntactically complex than contextualized talk. So to Pamela's point in the chat about, the syntactic structures of the input, you need to use more words to talk about the past or the future, right? It takes more language to talk about a different time point than it does to label something right in front of the child. So it ends up being more syntactically complex. We also know that parents who use more of this type of talk have children who use more of this type of talk. So that's just basically obvious. I showed you that example of the parent starts talking about tomorrow, the child goes right along with her, right? And so then the child's talking about tomorrow as well. So there's a pretty strong association within interactions, not surprisingly. But then what we also find is that child use of this type of talk predicts their academic language in 7th grade. And this is work with Paola. So basically controlling for a whole bunch of things, early vocabulary, the parent input, their PPBT scores. Still, the child's use of this type of abstract talk during the preschool years predicts their 7th grade academic language skills. So this seems like a pretty good area to sort of focus on in terms of if we're trying to think about how to promote language development through, I don't want to say manipulating, but just trying to provide parents or teachers with information about how to enhance the language environments of children. So to do this, this was the dissertation study of my former student, Katie Leach. She designed an intervention that we called Ready Talk, and I'll explain the ready part in a minute, which is basically a decontextualized language training for parents to increase young 4-year-olds exposure to decontextualized language. And the theory of change here was basically, if we could train parents by just informing them that this type of talk is helpful, and also that by using this type of talk, they can make a big difference in their child's language development. So there's this sort of efficacy or mindset piece involved. Then we thought that parents would increase their use of this type of talk and that the children would as well. So that was the goal. It was just sort of the first steps. Can we provide parents with information and see a change in the environment that also feeds down to the children? So we didn't think it would be appropriate to use the word decontextualized with parents. It's hard enough for us academics to understand it. So we decided to present this as with this Ready Talk short way of understanding it. So your talk is a great way to get your child ready for kindergarten. And basically the R stands for recalling the past events. E is those explanations of unfamiliar words or concepts. A is asking those open-ended questions. D is discussing future events. And then the Y is you can make a difference in your child's future academic success. So that's the sort of efficacy mindset piece. And what we did was, this is just a magnet we gave the parents as like a take-home reminder, but the intervention itself was a 15-minute video where we presented each letter one at a time. And each letter also had videos that followed it of examples of actual parents and their children engaging in these kinds of conversations. So parents would see the R, recall past events, and then they would see a couple little videos of a parent and their child talking about something they did recently. Okay, so we tested this out with a little pilot study where we brought, and we did this with middle class Cambridge families. So we really need to expand this work into other populations. But we brought 36 parent-child dyads with 4-year-olds into our lab at Harvard for what we called the family mealtime study, just because we were interested in trying to capture this type of talk during meal times. They came into the lab and they had a snack, and we told them they would be doing this, asked what kind of snack the children liked ahead of time. And basically they hung out in one of our rooms that was comfortable and had a snack together, and we recorded their snack for 7 minutes as a baseline measure of their decontextualized talk. Then we randomly assigned the groups to either the training or the control group. And the training group then saw this 15-minute video on an iPad with our researcher who asked comprehension questions afterwards. Basically, we watched the video with the parent and then afterwards said, so if you were going to explain that to a friend, how would you explain it? Then we sent all the families home with an audio recorder and asked them to record a mealtime once a week for the next month. And we collected all of those up. So we ended up with a corpus of 174 recordings nested within the 36 families. Okay, so we transcribed all of those recordings of the meal times, and then we coded them for the types of Ready Talk we had taught them about. So past events, like you gave that shirt to me last Father's Day, explanations, she can't have chocolate because she's a little baby, future events, I wonder who the parent helper is going to be at school today. And then open-ended questions. And then what did we do with the stuffed animals, or why are you going to have lunch with Candace? We took all of these together and put them in a composite that we called decontextualized language utterances. And then we used longitudinal modeling to see if there was any change over time by group. So what do we find? Here are the results for the parents. Basically, the proportion of utterances across the sessions that was decontextualized increased really pretty dramatically in the training group. These are the plots from the longitudinal growth models, which is why they're so like perfectly smooth. But basically there was a significant effect on growth such that the training parents were producing a faster change over time than the control group in their use of decontextualized language. And what you can see is you can read these as percentages. So at baseline, there was 10 to 20% of the talk was decontextualized. But then by the latter meal times, the training group was using 50% of their talk as decontextualized, which is really quite a lot compared to the control group. And then what's the most exciting part, and not super surprising, but what we were hoping for, is that we saw the same thing with the children, right? So the children can handle it, they engage in those conversations, and then they start producing these more interesting, abstract, complex utterances themselves. We also looked at, this was sort of a post hoc analysis. We only taught the parents about certain types of decontextualized talk. Of course, there's other types of talk that we would consider decontextualized when we were coding, right? Things like hypotheticals, use of generics, right? You can think there's all other good sort of abstract stuff going on. And so we did just look at that as well. And it turns out that the parents and the children in the training group used more of this other type of decontextualized talk also. So basically what you can see is on the left are the parents, on the right are the children. The black bars is the trained decontextualized talk that we coded. And then these dark gray bars is the untrained, the other decontextualized stuff they produce that we never talked to them about. And so you can see if you add that in for the training group, you get up to about 70% of their talk is what we would consider decontextualized, which is really quite a lot compared to about 30% for the control group. And this data is just from mealtime 4, but this was the same case in 3, 4, 5. And then we also looked at turn taking, right? So we started looking at this data and thinking, okay, well, these conversations that are abstract are interesting and they're going on for a long time. I mean, you saw that example I gave you. There was a lot of back and forths about the race and when's it going to be and am I coming? And so what we did was for each family, we took their longest conversation at the baseline time and then their longest conversation, I think again at time 4 or 3, and counted how many back and forths there were. And for the training group at the post, it was so much, they were up to 16 back and forths compared to 8. So these conversations are getting quite long. So it seems as if intervening around decontextualized language not only increased the amount of abstract talk, but it increased the length of the conversations that they were engaging in. And so what's important about this is that here we intervened at a level that we would call like that conceptual dimension, right? We intervened about like concepts, like talk about the past, talk about the future. Your kids can handle it. They like it. And then what happened is we see we're getting longer utterances. So that gets you into that, syntactic complexity of that linguistic dimension. And then we're also seeing we get longer conversations. So which gets into that interactive dimension as well. Okay, so to conclude about this study, we feel like it's possible to increase parents' use of decontextualized language with this one brief training session on Ready Talk. Of course, we need to try to do this a little more broadly in terms of other populations.
Meredith, there is a question about this, a very interesting question, I think. A question from Xian Yang. If a child is exposed to quality language input in one language at home, would the positive impact also show in the second language?
I mean, in general, I would say the quick answer is yes, but it's much more complex than that because it depends on the level of the child in the other language. I mean, maybe Catherine or Vibeke could comment on this if they've actually looked at it in terms of this topic.
Well, doesn't, okay, Catherine?
Yeah, well, I don't know. We could do this in the discussion too.
Yeah.
I think Meredith's absolutely right. It's not, yes, in principle, but only if the surrounding conditions are optimal, I guess.
Yeah, so let's come back to that. I think it's an important discussion point. Okay, great. And the only other concluding remark about this study was that, just that by intervening with parents, we were able to also increase what the children were doing in those interactions. So coming back here to our visual, I hope this makes sense and you can understand these different dimensions of interactionally supportive, linguistically adaptive, and conceptually challenging. I will say that much of what I talked about today, getting to the question, is really based on sort of Western culture. It's based primarily on monolingual children, but not exclusively. A lot of these things also hold with bilingual children, but we can talk about that a little bit more. But I think, and we wouldn't say that this is all universal. So for example, there could be cultures where maybe WH questions aren't as prevalent. And since they're not so prevalent, they might not be so helpful. And there could be something else, right? Some other way of communicating that's helpful for those kids that you would plug into this, graph in that particular community. So I just want to make sure that that's clear because, but I do think that we have seen these results pretty consistently across the samples that we do have, published papers written about. Okay. Yeah, and then I just wanted to conclude. So basically, we know that young children's social interactions with caregivers play a large role in their language and literacy development. Caregiver communication with children can and should be analyzed, at least we're arguing it can and should be analyzed along these different dimensions. I think what's happening in the literature is people tend to pick one variable. I mean, I'm guilty of this myself as well. You pick one thing you want to look at, it's WH questions, right? But, so that's important. But what do we know about, how fluid was that interaction? Were those questions conceptually challenging, right? So we were discussing that a little bit earlier. So in terms of analysis, it would be helpful to look at all of these different dimensions. And then I gave the one example of decontextualized language intervention as one way to try to sort of intervene in a way that crosses the dimensions, right? I mean, it's challenging. You can't really say to parents or preschool teachers, you need to use more relative clauses. I mean, that's not the kind of advice that most people would take up, right? It's hard when you're sitting there with a whole bunch of preschoolers to think, okay, I need to, use more complex sentences, right? On the other hand, if you say things like, oh, why don't you, talk more about the future and what's going to happen next week, right? Then they're sort of automatically using those longer multi-clause utterances and more conceptually challenging speech and get more back and forth conversations going. So I think that is the main points I wanted to make, and I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meredith. This was really fascinating. I think the idea of using these three dimensions to analyze and talk about language and young children are very, very helpful for us to extend our thinking about it and to improve our work. And this was really, really very insightful. There have been just a few questions, and they're related to the cultural and linguistic contexts in which children use and develop language. And I would like to summarize them actually in a question I was going to ask myself. And I hope that the people who have been asking these questions recognize what I mean. If you look at, I'll try to transfer it to the American situation. If you look at English language learners in preschool, who at home do not develop as typical as say native American children, and their conversational skills are not typical of their age. actually they come to preschool bringing very limited language. And do you think, is it conceivable that it would be more helpful for those children to be treated like infants in terms of the linguistic input they need? If you look at factors like repetition and contingency, is it conceivable that they would benefit more from being treated like infants than receiving the sophisticated vocabulary that is more or less advised for their age, but which is not appropriate for the level of development in this situation? What do you think?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, I can give you two pieces of evidence that sort of suggest that's not quite right. I mean, so even though they have lower language skills, that probably doesn't mean they have lower, cognitive skills across the board, right? And we know that there are many cognitive skills involved in language development. We did a study where we had a whole bunch of children who had experienced early prenatal brain injury, and we looked at their development longitudinally over early childhood and at the input the parents provided. And we actually found that the parents that were sort of dumbing down the input had children with slower language growth. And of course, it's hard to know which way to interpret that because they might have been responding to something in their child. But for those children as a group, the parents that sort of kept up the complexity of the syntax of the input were the ones whose children did better. Laura Justice also has some work in preschool classrooms where she's found that if you use mixed age classrooms, right, the children with the lower language skills, typically the younger children, right, like say the 2.5, 3-year-olds instead of the 4-year-olds in the classroom, they benefit greatly by having the peers with the greater skills in the classroom as well. So I think, so in general, I would say, if I had to give a yes, no answer to your question, I would say, no, don't talk to them like infants. But I do think that you also don't want to pitch the environment at a level that's going to be too complex, because then they won't get much out of it. So it's, it's a Vygotskian thing. You have to find that zone of proximal development where it's a little bit challenging, but not too challenging. But I do think that for, many children with language delay, that doesn't mean there's cognitive delay.
No, I quite agree. But the fact is, these children come to school without any knowledge of the English language. So even simple words will be unrecognizable for them, and they cannot utter simple words.
Okay,
they
yeah.
cannot understand simple words.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I thought you were talking about just delayed children in their first language. Well, in that case, I would say have a speaker in the classroom that speaks the other language as well would be the best.
Yeah, so I know this happens in American classrooms, but we have children from 15 different language groups in one classroom, so that's not conceivable. And I'm thinking also about how adults learn other languages. I would benefit from a repetition and from hearing separate words when I'm trying to learn Russian, for one thing. I mean,
absolutely. Well, I mean, the process of learning a second language like that, especially as an adult, is very different, right? You can,
yes, of course.
You don't need the social interaction even, really. You can use the audiobooks and the repetition and the practice, and you have those cognitive skills to make sense of that. Yeah, these are great questions. I mean, and so are you in Holland?
Yes.
Yeah. So you're in a situation where and we have this too, where you have many, many different children in the same classroom with all different languages and different levels of English. I mean, I think I would just suggest to teachers then, if they're teaching in English, you need to have different opportunities for different levels of across the day, right? I mean, there are certainly basic words that would be helpful for all children to learn in English, right? And you could make a point of making sure those words are taught explicitly, in a way you would teach a younger child. But then also having opportunities for more abstract discussion when the situation arises with the students who can handle it, for sure.
Yes, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, right. It's complicated.
Okay, there is a question from Yvonne Peck, which is more or less related to this. She says, would you ask more WH questions, for example, to older children with lower language abilities? Or have you actually already answered that question in your previous answer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends. Like with the WH questions, like I said before, there's sort of a continuum of them. Whether you're trying to elicit speech, what type of speech. So you could adjust those types of questions for the level of the child, see what they can handle and what's too hard. But giving children opportunities to speak is extremely important. And I think that's true. And we don't see that as much in preschool classrooms. Like, you know, I mean, there was a recent study that looked at one preschool classroom, but it was a very detailed study that showed that only 10% of the teacher's talk resulted in a conversation with a child. You know, and here we're talking about how important conversations are, right? Rather than just hearing talk. So, I mean, that's where I think WH questions are helpful because they require some sort of a response. You know, ideally you get a whole conversation going. Like teacher would ask a question and one child would say something and then another child and, you know. So I think if teachers can structure their classrooms to try to help children produce language more, that would be effective and helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite clear. Thank you. And as
I think Catherine's raising her hand. Did you want to say
yeah,
something?
okay, Catherine, would you like to elaborate on this?
Well, I'm one of the things that worries me as we talk about this. I mean, let me say, first of all, it was great fun to write this paper with Meredith, in part because she did about 80% of the work. but I think it was a real breakthrough, this idea that you can't talk about quality of the linguistic environment, that there are these multiple dimensions to quality of the linguistic environment, and that those dimensions under normal circumstances with, you know, monolingual families and I mean, although that's of course the less than normal circumstance, but under the circumstances that have been mostly studied, they tend to correlate with one another. You get your responsivity means that there's also an appropriate level of cognitive challenge, and that means that there's an appropriate level of linguistic complexity. But there are all kinds of situations in which those three dimensions kind of get fractured, and that's why you can't just talk about quality. You have to talk about, is this good interaction? Is this good appropriate levels of linguistic complexity? Is it appropriate levels of cognitive challenge? And so that's all.
Okay, that's very helpful, Catherine. I think appropriateness is perhaps a better term even than quality. Mm-hmm. If you put it like that. Because I was wondering, Meredith, when you talk about the opposition between quantity and quality, you've also been working on elaborativeness of parents and the narrative strategies parents and children use when they talk about past and future events. Mm-hmm. Could you elaborate a bit on that? Because it's not just a matter of quality as such, as Catherine says, it's also a matter of being elaborate enough to elicit talk.
Right, that's right. Yeah, I mean, let me just say that the quality is not the best word. I agree. It's, and I'm not so sure about appropriateness either, because in some ways we don't want to, there isn't one right way. You know, it's not, when you start talking about quality, you start saying high quality, low quality, and it's more like the qualities of, or the features of what the nature of the communication, I guess, rather than just the amount. I think, well, you know, the elaborativeness in reminiscing work is Deanna's work, really. I don't know if Deanna's still here. I saw her earlier. So she should really be the one to talk about that. But I think, I mean, I guess just on the surface level, it's sort of the same thing. You know, how much do you talk about the past is one way to look at it. And you could even call that a quantity measure, right? I mean, just counting up how often they talk about the past, right? We're not in this study I just talked about. But then in the other work, you know, there's a whole level of differences within the ways in which parents communicate with their children about the past and elaborate, and all those elaborations are so great for narrative development and memory development and all kinds of skills. So it's just another area where there's different surface levels that can be analyzed. But I think, you know, I think sometimes, at least with the intervention stuff, it's like just get the talk about the past happening more, and then you sort of hope that elaboration is going to come along with it, at least sometimes. But parents do vary quite extensively in their levels of elaboration. As Deanna.
Thanks. There is a question about Peru, Rosa Cerizales. She asked, what about parents and teachers with poor language? Parents and teachers with poor language, like some public schools in Peru, do they first need to improve their decontextualized talk?
No, I mean, I think we're talking about communicating with children who are under 5, and I can't imagine that if anyone is speaking in their native language, they don't have enough language skills to speak to a 4-year-old about what happened yesterday. I don't, and that's why I think we need to make sure we're not telling people use more complex sentences, because that's scary. You need to say something like, just have more conversations in the classroom about, you know, what you're working on and what might happen next. You know, I mean, there's so many opportunities in classrooms to have those conversations. You know, like the caterpillars are turning into butterflies, or the, you know, like science table talk or books, right? So I don't think that this is a situation where anyone that's working with young children needs to worry about their own.
I think maybe the concern here is mostly about the intervention that you showed us. The ready intervention was very easy to understand for the parents that you worked with. But for some parents, it may be less easy to understand and less self-evident to follow this type of instruction or advice. So some people are asking, what actually can you do with parents, with other kinds of parents?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Although I will say, like, you know, I summarized briefly some of the previous studies that we've done with decontextualized language, and many of those studies have been with, you know, for example, low-income families in Chicago, you know, different populations than the intervention. And one thing I can say is that in all of the work I've done, in all of the coding of all of the transcripts of lower families from lower income communities in the US, they are all producing decontextualized language. Okay. It's not something that at least in this context, I would think that we would have to teach, which is actually important. I think, and Deanna can speak to the Latino families. I mean, I think the important thing to do is to take the approach of like what, and that's why you get that baseline data. Like, what are the parents doing already that we know can be helpful, and then encourage them to do more of it. So in the Peru example, I think once you can gather an understanding of how parents in that community communicate with their children, you can find those gems, like those things they're doing that would promote learning, and then encourage them to do that more. So,
yes, if I may.
Yeah.
Hi, Diana.
So, like, I wouldn't characterize it as poor language. I think that that's a deficit approach to working with these families, and I don't think they have poor language. I think that sometimes there are some topics that elicit more of these interesting conversations with kids than others. And so it's more about finding what is it that the culture is interested in and invested in, and what are their cultural values. And then you can find very interesting conversations. In my work with low-income Latinos in the US, but also in Chile observations, they use a lot of these decontextualized, so like open-ended, explanations and talking about the past and talking about the future. But it depends on the context. So there are some contexts that are more, that elicit more of this conversation. So what we know from prior research is, for example, book reading, although we know that is really important, and in some cultures, it really elicits this. For Latinos, there are other contexts, such as, when you ask them to play together with toy food, or bake biscuits together, or things like that. You see all this elaborative talk. So it's also the context that promotes that. And maybe in book reading, Latinos are more likely to say, you sit down and you listen to the book, and I will tell you, and the child is not really producing, and the parent is not interested in asking questions as the parent reads. But in other contexts, they will be engaging in these high quality conversations. So I think we should not think about it as poor, or because they are poor in terms of financial means, then they have poor language. And this is also work that Sperry and others have done to challenge the original Hart and Risley. It's more about what context do we promote so that parents are more likely to engage in these interesting conversations with their kids.
Thank you, Diana. Diana, did you also work with the READY program, or was that another kind of program that you used?
It's another program, but it's based on the same Catherine idea.
Same idea.
Yeah, so the idea that
I'm asking it because people are really asking now in the chat, can we have access to READY, or I suppose something similar to that what Diana used? Is there access to READY for other people to use? Because of course we all want to see those graphics in our work.
Yeah, I mean, both of us have the public papers published that you can access, which describes the whole intervention. I have the video, it needs to be remade. We did this really it's not something that is ready to be shared around the world, but we're also trying to remake it now to make it sort of more sensitive to be used with broader populations. But I think all of the information, I can send the citation for the paper as well.
Oh yes, that would be very helpful. Thank you. And the video we will just wait for.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Sylvia has done some great work on variation of dialogue during play of low-income parents in Costa Rica. Sylvia, are you with us? I'm sure you are. Can you perhaps tell us something about that?
Hi, yes, I am here.
Hi, Sylvia.
I'm not turning on my camera, but yes, we did find interesting data with Costa Rican families. And I have to say that we did so within a very restrained, let's say, socioeconomic status. So because all the kids were from low income, and even so, we did find differences in the kind and the quality of talk that parents directed to them. And we also found differences in the different contexts that we observed. So yes, and it's very much in line with what Meredith has said, and also with what Diana said. Our best context for identifying high quality discourse was when children were playing with farm animals, with toy farm animals. So it kind of helped parents build on their language. But I'm not very sure why this happened. We tried to get, for example, explanation from giving them a kind of odd toy that they had to ask about, and we didn't get any of that. So our predictions about what was going to work with the kids were not really confirmed. We found other data. So this idea that Diana was talking about the you know, the local or this culturally specific interest is something that we have to be open to and kind of explore in every community and in every group. But yes, the paper is my doctoral dissertation. So whoever wants to look at it, it's available for everybody. Yeah.
That's great, Sylvia. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pity that we cannot see you really live, but this goes for all of us, I'm sure. I have one other question, unless there are any other questions in the chat. Let me just check. Is there anyone who would like to raise their hand to ask a question live to Meredith or Diana?
I
or
would
Sylvia,
love to.
Catherine?
And technically,
Yes, Renata. Okay.
Co-host,
Yes.
I can't actually raise my hand, which is odd. Among other really striking elements of your talk, Meredith, was just this notion that with a 15-minute video, you could get such impact. Do you have any sense from work with low-income families whether it would take more work with low-income families to have them understand and integrate the importance of talk, or whether I mean, it's really striking because what one thinks about scaling things,
Right.
and that's a very low-hanging fruit, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. One thing I should say that I didn't say is that we also texted them. So everyone watched the video, everyone in the training group, and then everybody went home with their recorders, and all the families in both groups got texts to remember, reminding them to record their meal times. But in the training group, we also said, and to use your ready talk, right? So there was this little like primer that probably made a difference as well, but they did get it, right? So, and I think that the analysis of the like non-trained decontextualized talk really sort of also shows that they kind of got the whole idea, right? It's not just talking about the past and future and explanations. It's also just, speaking in a more abstract way, right? So, my hypothesis is that it will work we've applied for many grants and are waiting patiently to hopefully do this with lower income families. And we've thought a lot about it. We've had focus groups with parents and shown them the video to see what they think, right? Like to get their feedback about the video, because we're trying to remake the video. My hunch is that it will work, and maybe not with that extension to the untrained stuff, but I think it'll work because at least what I've seen from low-income families in the US is that they are already doing these things. So it's sort of getting back to like, we're not teaching something new. We're building on something that they're already doing. So I don't know if we would get numbers as dramatic as we saw in this case or whatnot, but we are hopeful that at least in this, same culture with the lower income population, that we'll get similar findings, but I'll keep you posted.
Are you also considering, Meredith, extending this training to professionals? It is my impression that professionals also do not always have these ideas about decontextualized talk, and they pay a lot of attention to providing input. They talk a lot, assuming that this helps children to develop their language, but there's often quite little of decontextualized talk in preschool classrooms.
Yeah, that's right.
Have you any experience with this type of intervention with professionals?
Not personally, no. I mean, I'm aware of the literature, some by our colleague Noni Lasso, looking at when this type of extended discourse and talk occurs in preschool classrooms, and it does seem to occur in smaller group center-based types of interactions, with an adult and just a few kids, rather than the large group settings, but there are some, curricula out there to try to, like, as I said before, get more discussion going on in the classroom environment. I mean, I think that's the first step in some ways, just more discussion before we worry about more discussion about the future. But I think, and there are certainly some good programs out there for that, like how to use book reading with in large circle times to get discussion going about comprehension. But I haven't done this work with preschool classrooms, preschool teachers.
Okay, thanks very much, Meredith. Looking at the time, I think there are quite a few people who are probably preparing now for another meeting at 10:30. So I think maybe this is the right time to close up. Meredith, thanks again. This was really absolutely very, very helpful for all of us and very, very interesting. So thanks a million.
Thank you. I'm really sorry about the technical problems too. Forgive me. At least it worked.
Meredith, we haven't had a presentation this year without a technical problem. You're
Okay.
in the lead with everybody. This was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Great.
I would just like to point out that the next English language meeting we will have will be on the 3rd of September with a Prolier panel with the theme of stimulating children's language and literacy. And we will have Professor James Law from Newcastle University, who will talk about the effects of reading intervention on language development, findings from a systematic review and a population study. We will also have Adriana Buss, Emeritus Professor of Leiden University, who will talk about children's reading on paper versus screen. And we will have someone who is right with us today. I saw Angela Salmon, Assistant Professor at Florida International University, who will talk about children's cognitive and emotional engagement in tailoring the telling of a story. So I invite you to be there on the 3rd of September. In the meantime, there will be 2 Spanish language meetings to which I'm sure you will all receive an invitation in due course. So thank you very, very much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you again on the 3rd of September. Thanks, everybody.